All right. So I've shared with you a little bit about my pepeha, and I actually just wanted to share these images as well. So this is Kiavi, the land in Siumu and Sa'anga, where my mother is from. And these coconut trees here were planted by my mother and my grandfather. And this was a recent trip to Samoa. Also connecting to my awa in Siumu, which is Loloa. And this is our family home in Samoa. This is my father and my mother, and you'll notice my Dutch father here wearing his ear lava lava. And also this is my family. So I have 3 children, and my husband is from the Cook Islands, a place called Moke. So just making those connections there. So what I wanted to talk with you a little bit about today, and it is in the abstract, and I'll try and be as concise as possible because I'm mindful it's quite a lot to try and get through in such a short time frame. We could probably go on for days talking about this. Is looking at the discourse of global citizenship education, and importantly, the conceptualizations of Pacific and Pasifika. Some of you might have heard the term Pasifika said before, or the term Pacific said before, and kind of maybe wondered what is the difference between those. Looking at problematizing global citizenship education discourse, and then delving into Pacific Indigenous philosophy to kind of think differently about this concept of global citizenship education. So, global citizenship education, there are core tenets here of global citizenship education. And there was a definition given by UNESCO in 2015. And the definition is really about an emphasis on a strong sense of belonging to a broader and global humanity, particularly around, political, cultural, economic, and social interconnectedness and interdependency. And the definition itself is really looking at grounding it upon a common human rights foundation, looking at being socially just, and also drawing in democratic ideologies. So other features of global citizenship education, which might be sort of I guess more sort of covert to the narrative of global citizenship education, are neoliberalism, and then unpacking sort of the democratic traits of global citizenship education. Something we're all familiar with here, I'm sure, is around global marketization, which we know pervades education, particularly around bureaucratic interest, around profit-driven marketization of education programs. And, this is something that's also evident in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Also looking at, the push towards future-focused innovations, but also, I have to ask, what do we risk when we privilege global knowledge versus local knowledges? What do we risk in that? So it's not a universal concept when we start to go deeper into the tensions of these definitions. I would say it is the local Pacific knowledges for Pacifica peoples that actually encourage the connection to local knowledge systems, to place, to ancestors, and to people. And I also would call into question the way that sometimes normative ideals are threaded through, and what happens there for local Indigenous knowledge in terms of it sustaining itself. So this could be thinking about, our Fijian Indigenous knowledge systems, our Marshall Islands Indigenous knowledge system. So from location to location, right across Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, right across Moana Nui. I also want to just touch on the fact that education, formal education philosophy in New Zealand is actually fundamentally based on traditional Western education concepts and philosophy. And a lot of those ideals are around liberal ideologies and progressive ideals. And with that, they prescribe a particular identity of the learner, you know, and that is mainly that the learner is an individual, autonomous, and self-directing. So we need to think about these terms that kind of permeate some of these broader education concepts we engage with. All right, I also write poetry, so I had to put some poems in here for us. So here we go. Here is one poem that I wrote a couple of years ago, but it's one that I think as we think about notions of innovation and education, we need to be mindful of the history and how we come to arrive at, you know, a knowledge economy. So threads of knowledge production. Colonial legacies stitch together the global knowledge economy with concealed threads, capitalizing knowledge and suppliers compete, bright and alluring packaged material, stitching, education, supply and demand, education for learning and unlearning of localized wisdoms, globalizing the local fabric of being, formulating globally standardized pedagogies for teaching and learning, decontextualized to place, space, and the threads that bind relationship, politicizing Pacific intersubjectivity as failure. Now, the notion of Pacific success is something that I've traversed my whole life, you know, through my own experiences in education. And quite often, you know, I've come to question in my own journey of education is, you know, who is framing this notion of success and how can I take ownership of what that might look like for me? And I think these are really important questions as we all engage with education and our ways of teaching and learning. So this is just one little sort of poem that came to me as I was thinking through these questions. I'll keep moving on. I want to share with you this image. And you'll notice the little dots and the mapping here and the vastness of the cosmos above, and then the va'a that is located in the oceans below. This is an image taken from the Cook Islands, and it's actually designed by a young digital artist, and his name is Joseph Ravlich. And he's a digital artist of Cook Island descent. And as I was thinking about preparing for this presentation today, you know, I felt that this image is a really good way of speaking to this notion of globalization. So globalization in the Pacific is not new. You know, it's deeply embedded in the histories of Pacific culture. Pacific oceanic navigators, for example, crossed vast distances to trade and to populate new lands and generate new understandings of social and cultural exchange. When I think about that, it is exciting to think that, you know, these paths have been traversed before. I want to draw a particular distinction now to contextualize the notion of Pacific and Pasifika, particularly in an Aotearoa New Zealand context, because I'm sure many of you have kind of wondered about what is the difference between Pasifika and Pacific. So migration from the Pacific Islands to New Zealand between the 1950s and the 1970s, you know, it was spurred by the increasing demand of the manufacturing sector in New Zealand. The labor demand required, you know, skilled and semi-skilled workers. And then New Zealand turned to the Pacific because the Pacific is, you know, Aotearoa is in the Pacific. And so it called for that labor demand from local Pacific neighbors. So while the manufacturing sector was productive in New Zealand, there was little concern about the increase of migration of Pacific peoples. However, when the economic crisis arose and unemployment became an issue in Aotearoa, the Labour government sought to revoke Pacific migrants' working visas. So this event exposed tensions within society. Pacific people were seen as taking valuable employment opportunities for New Zealand residents, although the majority of illegal working migrants were from Europe and South America, and that's taken from Spoonley 2013. Pacific peoples were targeted as the problem in New Zealanders' jobs, and therefore one of the major causes of the economic issues. So what I'm saying here is, being conscientious of labeling and shaming of Pacific peoples as overstayers. So those were some of the terminologies we need to be critical about. And then as we move on, we also realize, so as Pacific people or Pacific Islands people settled here within Aotearoa and became, second generation, even third generation, there was this evolution of this term Pasifika. And so the term Pasifika itself evokes a really strong sense of connection, a strong sense of feeling. So it's a collective reference to Pacific Islands peoples who have made New Zealand their home. And it's also inclusive, like I said, of New Zealand-born Pasifika peoples. And there are a broad range of Pasifika ethnic groupings, which are recognized in, in New Zealand governmental policies. We have Tonga, Fiji, Cook Islands, Niue, Tokelau, Tuvalu, keeping in mind there are realm nations with Aotearoa New Zealand. That is Tokelau, that is Niue, as well as the Cook Islands. But it's not only limited to these as well, okay? So the term Pasifika was first used in New Zealand education context. And this term actually came about in the 1980s, and it was used in early childhood. And it was a community construct, and it was called Anau Ako Pasifika. So it was a very community-centered project that looked to unite parents to teach their young children to revitalize the use of Pacific languages in New Zealand. So this is where the difference is between Pacific, which refers to the broader region, and Pasifika, which is sort of a collective symbol used within New Zealand to reference to Pacific Islands people who live here. I hope that helps to clarify that for you. Now, I kind of want to jump now to the next slide, which looks at Pacific education and the nature of knowledge. Now, I want to also just show you this timeline here, which focuses on pre-colonial Indigenous knowledge systems, and they're thousands of years old right across the Pacific. This is before the era of colonization. So traditionally, the processes of learning were usually embedded in family life, and it included particular roles within the family in which members also learn and develop an understanding of their role in society. Language and social behavior learned through daily interactions and exchange amongst family was supported, and the family's collective function was made visible, in connection to village community, and also the social strata and hierarchy of village life. So it is a family's collective responsibility to ensure the passing of intergenerational knowledge, such as genealogy, such as cultural practice, and the social obligations and skills and responsibility. Traditionally, learning was usually through memorization, very careful listening skills, and observation, as well as the practical application. So through this process, the learner acquired the teacher's expertise and knowledge, and it was most often through an elder. Pre-colonial Eastern Polynesian societies had more formal learning institutions while Western Polynesian societies generally did not have formal learning institutions. There were common practices for learning, and for, however, the intergenerational presence of knowledge exchange is a common feature. So I've created this little diagram just to help you so we can juxtaposition between traditional Western education and traditional pre-colonial Indigenous education. I'm going to jump to this one. I hope you can see it. The words might be a little bit small, I apologize. But I just want you to see this because, you know, it's quite interesting just to see the contrast between the two here. So if we look at teachers from a traditional Indigenous education context across the Pacific, you know, teachers were family members, cultural experts, you know, the environment is a teacher, not only human beings being teachers, but the environment is a teacher, not funded, not constrained by set time frames. And then we might look at the traditional Western education. Often strangers could be disconnected to familial context. They'll have certain qualifications, be a member of a profession in paid employment. Practices are with scheduled time frames, not necessarily connected to the learner, and tied to professional teacher identity. So this is just a contrast between two very different ways of teaching and learning. The other one I want to touch on down here is looking at the identity of the learner. So the learner can also be a teacher, connected to family and ancestors, and has mana. So, you know, if we just compare them with that going across there, you can see some differences there. And I kind of wondered, you know, when formal Western education was introduced right across the Pacific, how did it sit within village communities to have such a different approach introduced into the sort of integration of Western knowledge systems in Indigenous-based communities? So also looking at the nature of knowledge, which is really important down the bottom here. This is the epistemology. This is the epistemological questions, you know. Knowledge, for traditional Indigenous education, knowledge is collective in nature. So it's not only human beings who hold knowledge, the environment holds knowledge, which I think is quite an interesting way to think about knowledge. And then from the traditional Western education, there is a sense of individual ownership around knowledge, whether it's a discovery of knowledge or a discovery of a new concept or an idea. Looking at the sacred nature of knowledge, and then also the idea of open access to knowledge, two very different views around knowledge. An Indigenous view that knowledge is holistic. So your hands can know, your feet can know. Whereas a traditional education, there is a strong focus on the intellect or the cognitive capacities around knowledge and knowledge production. So, I mean, I could go on a lot about knowledge, but we'll keep moving on. I do want to ask this question, though, because ontological questions are really important for us to think about when we think about global citizenship education. So what are ontologies that we may take for granted when we conceptualize global citizenship education? We talk about a shared humanity, and we talk about social justice, and we talk about equity. But what are some of the things, what are some of the ontological concepts even that we might take for granted when we think about this? And I think, you know, it is really important for all of us to continually question these things, because this is how we ensure, I guess, a more robust and socially just way to approach global citizenship education. So here, I want to one of my favorite authors, and I shared this quote yesterday in the porphyry that I had at AUT, but it really is a powerful quote for us to reconceptualize these ontological questions, right? So Ipili Hau'ofa reminds us that we need to let our ancestors right into our world, to come and dance with them in our world. We learn from them through the continuity between us and them. And also, more importantly, our distinct identity within the world system, with the depth of our history, will bring our ancestors to us, carry our spirits and bring them forward to our world willingly. So I ask these questions: what is being? What is being human? What is self? What is citizenship? And what is belonging? And I think for all of us here, we would have our own definitions around this, but we need to ask ourselves, how do we arrive at those definitions? How do we arrive at these understandings? And how do we continue to engage with those concepts in the way that we think of community or in our own teaching practices? I'm going to keep moving on now. I just want to share with you this image. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's an image that really has a long history in the Western canon of even education and education philosophy. And it is the great chain of being. And it does shape, I guess, in a sense, the genesis of thinking about human beings, right? And what it means to be human. Because one of the premises here is that, I mean, this image itself, I don't know if you can see it clearly, I hope you can, but it positions God at the top, and then you have certain rankings and hierarchy in this great chain of being. And obviously, right at the bottom there are non-sentient beings. So things that do not have a heartbeat, you know, what it does is it separates human beings from the natural world, you know, and this is another thing called the culture and nature divide, or the nature culture divide, that human beings are above everything that is not human. So everything else is an other. Okay, and so, you know, we carry these ideas today. Sometimes, you know, not even knowingly we carry these ideas. But it's good to call this into question, to call this great chain of being into question. When we think about those that are privileged within this hierarchy, I mean, it was also part of the emphasis around colonization, thinking about those that could, you know, be dominated, or those that could become slaves for the benefit of those who are in the upper level of the hierarchy. So, you know, it's deeply entrenched in histories for many, many nations, you know, this idea of the great chain of being. Not only Pacific Indigenous peoples, but Indigenous peoples right across the world, you know. So, and then I would also add, because it's premised too on man's ability to reason, you know, we think of enlightenment here. It creates a separation for anyone else who does not have that ability. So I would even pose in there, you know, where do those with neurodiverse needs come in? You know, where do the needs, if we look at this ranking too, men were above women, you know, so it's also gendered as well. There's lots of ways that we can pick apart this hierarchy in the great chain of being. I could go on and on around this one, but I'll keep us moving along. One of my other favorite authors is Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who writes extensively about decolonising research. And I use a lot of her work too to decolonize education. But, you know, one of her quotes here is she says, Indigenous peoples' inherent rights and responsibilities connect to particular tracts of land. The rights to land cannot be bought or sold or reinvented. They were established in the ancestral past of Indigenous peoples around the world and are reiterated in the present through conceptualizations of spirituality. Thus, the land is central to the definition of self. So if we think about what she said there, and then we come back to these questions, I would think, you know, here we are reimagining this notion of self, that self is not separate from the land, you know, that self is not separate from your own ancestors and the connection of those before you. So I would wonder, how was that visible in the notion of citizenship? You know, I also think of our tangata moana, our people across the moana who are becoming displaced. They are forever tied to their land, but because the sea levels are rising, they are becoming displaced. I would argue, what is the notion of citizenship there? How do we reimagine that connection? I'll keep us moving along. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but yeah, so I want to share this quote with you. Pacific people share deep-rooted connections through ancestral ties to people, to place, inclusive of the environment and the cosmos. Pacific Indigenous knowledge systems ground genealogy as a construct that connects people as kin with the world, unlike the hierarchies of man presented in the Great Chain of Being. The relational ontology, or the VAR, in Pacific Indigenous knowledge systems positions the human as co-existential and co-evolutionary with the world. Thus, genealogy sustains an ecology of worlded relationships. I will share with you my last poem. This is one of my favorite ones, and I'm actually walking across our whanua, our land in Samoa, and you can see it's wild. It's just thriving. The plants and the land is really thriving there. But I wrote this poem on this trip to Samoa in 2019, and it's called Entangling of Whanua and Being. Entangling of whanua and being. I heard of this place in many a story where the green leaves are curled before opening, the swift cut of the blade clearing a path. My grandfather labored in earth, and earth labored in him. Hand in soil, deep below where the moisture rests, he somehow knew. Stretched out hands below the earth, reach knowing, earth's knowing, entangling of whanua, malamalama le whanua. Would he know of his influence, the impression in soil that his grandchild would someday walk? Hands in soil that hold me tight, that reach for my belonging. He somehow knew. So that's the end of my presentation. Whawhataitele lava.